Okay, part 2. We want to start fixing the deformations that we got from the automatic weights. For that, we first need to see the deformations, which means we have to pose the character. I'm going to show you the basics of weight painting in one of the next chapters. But Blender has a really cool feature that allows you to pose your characters while you paint the weights. You can support CGDive by purchasing this course or some of the exclusive courses on academy.cgdive.com. Subscription is also available. So one approach that we could take is to visualize the deformation layers of our Rigify rig. Shift select the character, go to weight paint, start posing it, and then painting weights. And that's great for simple characters, but when you have an important character where you want to ensure that it's going to work in all sorts of situations, then there is a better approach. And basically what it is creating this weird animation for your character, test animation, which puts the character in all sorts of extreme poses, one after the other. And that allows you to see 1, deformation problems, and 2, problems with the rig itself. If a constraint or some sort of relationship is not working correctly, then you'll be able to spot it. The test animation will look something like this. It will take 10 or 15 minutes to do, but it will allow us to spot problems much easier, and that will save time in the long run. So let's undo. Hide the deformation layers. Go to pose mode for the generated rig. So first I want to focus exclusively on the arm area, which includes the pecs and shoulder and a little bit of the back. So I'm going to hide all of the layers that I don't need. The tweak layers I don't need actually. Legs I don't need. We will repeat the same process for the legs later. And for the arms, I think using FK will be easier in this case. So I'm going to hide the IK controls. This kind of layer setup is good in my opinion. And then I want to switch to FK by moving this slider all the way to 1. And I want to make sure that I'm at frame 0, and I want to hover over this slider and press I. And that will create a keyframe for the IK-FK switch control. The reason I'm doing this is that at some point we may want to tweak the metarig and regenerate, and when we do, all of these settings will be reset to their default state. But if I have a keyframe over here, I'll only need to switch to my action, which will be preserved, and these settings will be reset automatically. So I want this weird test animation to be applied to both arms. One thing that I could do is in pose mode, I could activate X-axis mirror. If I set this arm to IK as well, that will mirror my poses. But I'm going to turn X-axis mirror off. I'm going to only animate this arm, the left arm, and then we're going to paste the action into the right arm, which is an important workflow to be aware of. So I want to animate the clavicle, upper arm, lower arm, wrist control, and all of the fingers. And at frame 0, I want to set rotation keyframes for all of these widgets. And for the fingers, I can also scale, which bends the whole finger. So I want to also set a scaling keyframe. Okay, and from here, the whole process consists of moving 20 frames on the timeline and creating a new pose. Add-ons are a great way to speed up your Blender workflow. Discover awesome, free and paid Blender resources on addons.cgdive.com. So now I'm going to start creating my poses. I already did this a couple of times, and I have a list of poses that I decided are important so that I don't fumble too much around. So to make things a little bit easier and faster, I want to enable auto keying. And under keying, active keying set, I want to choose available. And that will ensure that I only set keyframes that I need. The first pose that I want is very simple. I just want the arm to be straight. At frame 20 in front view, I'm just going to rotate this arm until it looks kind of straight, and I can verify the motion. And then from here, I'm going to start with the fingers, then the wrist, lower arm actions, and then we'll move to the upper arm. So I'm going to select all of the fingers. I'm going to select this keyframe, Shift D, and duplicate it to around frame 20. And now first pay attention to my pivot point and orientations. The pose I want on frame 40 is something like a thumbs up. So I'm going to scale down these widgets for the fingers, which bends the fingers. And then in front view also rotate them so they form a little bit of a fist. And this bone I want to extend out and also scale up a little bit. And I can already spot some problems with the thumb, but I'm not going to fix them right away. First I'm going to finish my animation and then try to fix all problems that I notice one by one. Now I'll go to frame 60, select all of the fingers except for the thumb, and press Alt-S and Alt-R to return to the default state. And then from front view, I'm going to rotate the fingers up a little bit and then scale them up. The pinky seems to be rotating in a weird way. Again, I'm just noticing this and not trying to fix it right away. And for the thumb, I want to bring it in this time. Something like this. Now for frame 80, I'll leave the thumb as it is. I think I have enough motion for it. And then select all of these fingers, Alt-S, Alt-R to return them to their previous state. And then I'm going to try to spread them out, which shouldn't be a problem, but I just want to test this kind of motion. On frame 100, select all finger widgets, Alt-S and Alt-R to return to the default position. So in this case, that's all I'm going to do for the fingers. These poses that I'm going to give you for the fingers and arms and everything, they are not some sort of predefined motion that I know of. I just thought of very extreme poses and try to hit them. The more poses you set, the better you can check your rig. But next I want to focus on the wrist motion. So on frame 100, I'm going to set a keyframe by pressing I. Then I'm going to move to frame 120 and I want to rotate the wrist counterclockwise on the y-axis. And you probably noticed a really ugly flipping happening. And now if I try to play the animation, something else is weird, and that is, even though I rotated the arm counterclockwise, it is now rotating clockwise. This has to do with the rotation settings for this joint. Rotation for this wrist are set to quaternions. Now I'm not going to try to explain Quaternions and Eulers. One resource that I do recommend is an old course called Humane Rigging. It is an old course for Blender 2.6 or 7, so the interface will be slightly different, but the technical explanation that you get there are some of the best that you can get. But a basic difference between Quaternions and Eulers is that Quaternions do not care about direction. When you rotate using Quaternions, Blender just finds the shortest path that is available to get from point A to point B. Eulers, on the other hand, do care about direction. The weakness of Eulers is something called gimbal lock. It is a very important concept in rigging. So for the wrist and lower arm, Eulers are actually quite suitable, especially for the lower arm since it only rotates on the x-axis. When a bone rotates on only one axis, then there is no chance of gimbal lock. So I can switch to Eulers over here in the generated rig, but every time we regenerate from the metarig, these settings will be reset. So you can actually go to the metarig, set the respective bones to Eulers in the metarig, so lower arm to Eulers and hand to Eulers. Same thing for the right arm and hand. And now if I generate, hide the metarig, and select my wrist control, it has been set to Euler. The lower arm as well, but the upper arm is still in Quaternions. Since the upper arm has a lot of freedom of rotation, the Quaternions will work perfectly. Okay, now if I scrub the timeline, there is no animation. We need to go to the dope sheet and select our action. And here it is. I'll switch back to timeline. Now, I did set some keyframes for the lower arm and wrist, but keyframes for Quaternions and Eulers are different. So now I need to select all of these keyframes and delete them and set them anew. So here at the first keyframe, I want to set rotation keyframes. If I try to press I get this error message. That is because King set is set to available and there is nothing available right now. So remove it for a second, set rotation, and then switch it back to available. Okay, then I'm going to go to frame 100, set another keyframe here so that these bones do not move until frame 100. And then on frame 180, I can set my wrist motion. I'll rotate it until the palm is kind of looking up. I'll get this ugly flipping here. By the way, one of the ways that I come up with these extreme poses is to move my own arm and observe it. And to me, it seems that the wrist can rotate to about this position. Now, if I scrub the timeline, you'll see that the rotation direction is correct. And that is thanks to switching to Eulers. Next, I'm going to go to frame 140 and rotate the arm in the opposite direction. And again, I'm observing my own arm and I try to estimate what the extreme pose would be. On frame 160, I just want to return to the default pose. So I'm going to press Alt-R and a keyframe will be set for me automatically. Next, I want to start moving the lower arm. So again, I'm going to press I here to set the keyframe and then move 20 frames ahead. For the lower arm, all I want is to rotate it on the x-axis. I'm going to set an extreme pose like this. As you can see, things are pretty ugly over here. There's a lot of overlapping of geometry. Let's see how we are going to fix this later. On frame 200, again, I'm going to just press Alt-R for this lower arm and bring it back in the default position. Next, I want to start manipulating the upper arm. So on frame 200, set a keyframe for it so that it doesn't move until that frame. And then 20 frames later, I want to test the Y rotation of the upper arm as well. So I'm going to rotate it counterclockwise again. Eventually you'll see some sort of flipping, but I think this pose is already pretty extreme before we see the flipping, so I'm not going to worry too much about it. I'm just going to set a keyframe before the flipping happens. Then on frame 240, I want to rotate the arm in the opposite direction until the elbow is kind of pointing up. Because the upper arm is in Quaternions, you may get this problem that we had with the lower arm. It may be rotating in the opposite direction to the one that you are trying to rotate it in. In that case, just try to reset your keyframes, delete your keyframes and set them again until it works as intended. On frame 260, I want this arm to return to the straight position. So I'm just going to copy this frame 200 to 260. On frame 280, I want to move my arm up. And when you move the arm up, always consider the clavicle rotation as well. Now, for the clavicle, I just have one frame at frame 0, one keyframe at frame 0, and then one at 280, which means that the clavicle will be rotating very, very slightly the whole time, which is not what I want. I want this frame to be copied to 260, and that way the clavicle will stay in place until 260, and then we'll start moving up. Okay, next I want to bring the arm again in the straight position, so I'm going to select both the clavicle and the upper arm, select this frame 260, Shift D and duplicate it to frame 300. For frame 320, I want the arm to move downwards. And I'll hide the layers that I don't need. And for the same frame, I want to move the clavicle down. For the range of motion of the clavicle, which is very important, from what I've seen, it seems that when it moves down, it can rotate around 15 degrees. And when the arm goes up, it can go up to around 30 degrees. And here I'm going to correct the arm a little bit so that it's more or less straight. Let's jump 20 frames ahead. And now I want to move the arm back a little bit. The backwards movement or rotation of the arm is somewhat limited. It cannot go very far. I think this position is more or less the maximum that it can go. And again, I want to move the clavicle back a little bit. And 20 frames later, I want the arm to return to the downward position. So I'm going to just copy these keyframes from 320 for both the clavicle and upper arm. And then I want to move the arm up in the side view until it's kind of straight. This will again affect the clavicle. It will move forward a little bit. I can correct the position a little bit if I want. And then I want to continue this motion at frame 400 until the arm is pointing upwards. And I want to move the clavicle a little bit as well. If I rotate this arm very far upwards, there is a little bit of flipping, but I think this pose is so extreme that we don't need to worry about it too much. For the next pose, I want the arm to be straight again. It seems that it was straight on frame 260, so I'm going to copy these keyframes for clavicle and upper arm to 420. Then from the top view, at frame 440, I want to rotate the arm like that, the clavicle as well. And in 460, which will be the last pose, I want to try to hit a very special pose. This is a pose that I know that I'm going to want for this character. And also it is a very extreme pose that guarantees that we'll have some interesting problems. In the tools, I'm going to enable Auto IK. I think that will enable me to hit this pose easier. Then I'm going to grab the lower arm and move it like this. This is more or less the pose that I wanted. The animation that I envision is the ogre bringing his arms backwards and then swinging and hitting something in front of him. Now the lower arm and wrist were not moved since 200, so I need to duplicate their last keyframe all the way to frame 440. Actually, what I can do is go to frame 440 and press Alt-R. And that will set a keyframe in their default position, and that way they won't move until I need them to. So here is the amazing animation that we produced. And that will help us tremendously in the next stages. In the beginning, I said that I'm going to show you how you can copy this animation that we just did for the left arm and transfer it to the right arm. Blender has a very handy way to transfer poses. So if I have this bone selected and go to pose and press copy pose, I can select then the arm on the other side. And if I just choose paste pose, that won't work. But if I choose paste pose flipped, then I'll get the same pose but for the opposite arm. But I'm going to undo here. Instead of copying and pasting poses, I want to copy and paste the whole animation. So what I need to do is select all widgets that were animated. And then I'm going to need a graph editor. In here, I'm going to press Alt-H to make sure that there isn't anything hidden. Select all curves by pressing A in this area, and then press Ctrl-C to copy them. Now I'm going to select all of these widgets on the other side. And now I want to paste the flipped motion. The shortcut for that is Ctrl Shift and V, but now nothing will happen. The reason for that is that we first need to have at least one keyframe for these widgets before we can paste something in their information. So now I want to set a keyframe, but again, I have to get rid of the active keying set. And I'm going to set rotation for all of these and then scaling for the fingers. Then again, I'm going to select all of these. And now if I press Ctrl Shift V over here, the motion will be pasted. The arm won't move yet because I need to switch it to FK mode. Now it will move. And then I also want to set a keyframe at frame 0 for the IK-FK switch. And now I get the exact same motion on each hand. As you can see, things are not looking too well, but with a quick weight paint, it will look much better. And then by adding the additional correction bones, things will start to improve even more. That's it for this chapter. Please like, subscribe, and check out our other projects, academy.cgdive.com and addons.cgdive.com.